Imagine believing that the simple, universal human desire for love is actually, well, that it's the starting gun for this massive cosmic battle.
Oh, yeah. It scales up incredibly fast.
Right. Like a battle that dictates the outcome of the Cold War and, casts whole nations as literal biblical figures.
Exactly.
And on top of all that, it absolutely requires you to learn the Korean language just to avoid deep shame in the afterlife.
Yeah.
That is the sprawling, intense worldview we are mapping out today.
It really is a sweeping architectural blueprint of a belief system.
Yeah, today's deep dive is focusing on a single, incredibly complex source. We're looking at excerpts from a 1983 speech titled About Myself, which was delivered by Reverend Myung in New York.
And, it takes theology, linguistics, race relations, and 20th century geopolitics, and it locks them all into one highly intricate, interconnected framework.
Every single piece relies on the others. But before we dive into the deep end of that framework, I do want to set some ground rules for you, the listener.
Right, very important.
Because our mission today is purely exploratory. This material contains some highly provocative political and theological views. We are talking about aggressive stances on global conflict, on communism, and, well, very specific racial and gender dynamics.
Definitely.
So we are absolutely not here to endorse or validate or even judge these views. Our goal is strictly to reverse engineer this belief system. We want to understand its internal logic, how the gears turn, and, how it attempts to provide an answer for absolutely everything in the universe.
And that internal logic is really the key to understanding any totalizing worldview. You have to start at the bedrock.
Exactly.
And for this philosophy, the bedrock isn't a political theory. It begins with a highly specific definition of the nature of God and the fundamental purpose of human beings.
So let's start right there, because the entire geopolitical roadmap, like all the language demands, all the Cold War strategies, it all stems directly from how this system defines God's vulnerability.
Yeah, vulnerability is a good word for it.
Yeah, vulnerability is a good word for it. The foundational claim here is that God is invisible and intangible. But because human beings are physical creatures, we naturally seek a visible, physical representation of the divine, right? Something we can actually trust and relate to in the real world.
Which leads to a really profound theological pivot. The architecture of this belief system dictates that while God has ultimate power and, created the universe, there is exactly one thing he cannot do.
Which is wild to think about.
Right. He cannot create love for himself in a vacuum. Love requires an object, and that object is mankind.
So it's a two-way street.
Exactly. The underlying mechanism here is that joy, hope, and love are relational dynamics. God needs humanity to experience true love just as desperately as an artist needs a canvas, or a man needs a woman.
Okay, let's unpack this. It's like saying God is the ultimate comedian, but even the greatest comedian in the universe can't create laughter in an empty room.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right. They absolutely need an audience to spark that connection.
Yeah.
They need someone there to receive the joke and laugh, or the joy just doesn't manifest. It remains entirely theoretical.
What's fascinating here is how this framing flips traditional Orthodox theology entirely on its head.
Yeah, how so?
Well, in classical traditions, God is entirely self-sufficient, right? He is perfect and doesn't technically need anything. But in this worldview, God is fundamentally unfulfilled, almost tragic, honestly, without human beings.
Wow. Tragic is a strong word.
But it fits. He is described as wandering, just waiting for a place to settle. The philosophy claims that since the fall of humanity, God has had no motherland on Earth.
So he's homeless, basically.
Exactly. He desperately needs humans to establish a physical, grounded presence, a
Yeah.
culture and a language developed entirely out of his love.
And to build that physical motherland, the system introduces this structural concept called the four-position foundation.
Right.
And it's not just a vague idea of happy family. It's presented as this rigid, three-dimensional spiritual grid.
A grid is a great way to describe it.
Yeah, the ideal motherland only manifests where God, the true parents on earth, and true children exist together in a perfect, unbroken feedback loop of love.
And the true parents act as the indispensable grounding wire in that grid. Without them, God's energy remains entirely in the spiritual ether.
It would pull it down to earth.
Yes. But restoring humanity to this perfect grid isn't just a matter of making a positive life choice. You can't just wake up and decide to step back into the Garden of Eden.
Right, there's a cost.
Exactly. The philosophy introduces this cosmic mechanism called indemnity.
Okay, hold on. I'm stuck on this idea indemnity.
Mhm.
Because if God is all-powerful and desperately wants humans back, why create a system where humans have to pay off a spiritual penalty just to talk to him?
It sounds counterintuitive, right?
Yeah, like what is the psychological mechanism at play there?
Well, think of it less as a punishment from an angry god and more as a law of physics within the specific universe. Like, if you drop a glass and it shatters, you can't just apologize to fix it. You have to physically expend energy to glue it back together.
Oh, that makes sense.
Indemnity is the spiritual energy required to reverse the fall. Humanity is in a state of deficit. So to bridge the gap back to the divine, you have to engage in high-cost spiritual labor. It's a mandatory mechanism of spiritual debt repayment.
So it's essentially a cosmic credit score.
Pretty much.
Humanity maxed out its cosmic credit card in Eden, and you can't just declare spiritual bankruptcy. You have to pay down the principal through this indemnity, which usually involves immense personal sacrifice.
Absolutely.
But that brings up a huge logistical issue for me. If God needs this physical motherland, and humans are paying off their spiritual debt to get back to him, how do they actually communicate? Like, what language does heaven use?
And that logical necessity drives the philosophy straight into linguistics. If God's thought must be uttered on earth to create a physical reality, there must be an original language. And because the true parents happen to be Korean, the logic dictates that God had to adapt to that specific geographic and cultural reality.
He had to use what was available.
Exactly. He had to express his love through the Korean language. Therefore, in this system, Korean isn't just a national tongue. It is designated as the eternal, original language of all humanity.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because, wait, if the original language of humanity is purely based on the geographic coincidence of where the true parents arrived, doesn't that make the universal language highly circumstantial?
It completely does.
It's essentially saying, well, this is where they landed, so the entire cosmos must adopt this specific grammar structure.
It seems entirely circumstantial, yeah, until you look at the psychological leverage it provides.
Yeah.
Within the logic of this system, absolute linguistic unity is the mandatory prerequisite for global spiritual unity. If you want to enter the realm of heart, which is the deepest spiritual connection with God, you have to abandon your native tongue.
Because your native tongue is flawed.
Exactly, because your native language carries centuries of cultural baggage, historical divisions, and fallen concepts.
Wow.
Stripping a follower of their native language is a profoundly effective way to strip away their old identity. By adopting Korean, you are adopting a new, unified standard of human thought. It basically builds a linguistic moat around the community.
And the pressure applied to enforce this is just intense. I mean, think about how hard it was when you tried to learn a second language in high school.
Oh, impossible.
Right. Now imagine your eternal soul depends on it. The philosophy explicitly warns American followers that English is a deviated language.
A deviated language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It threatens actual profound shame in the spirit world. It argues that if you die and can only speak English, your ancestors will literally blame you because you won't be able to speak directly to the true parents in the native tongue of heaven.
The leverage is absolute. The philosophy praises Korean as having the richest variety of adjectives, claiming it allows for a total spectrum of emotional expression that English simply lacks.
So English is just too clunky for divine love.
That's the argument. It asserts that even the greatest genius translating Korean to English can only capture about 70% of the true meaning.
Wait, 70%?
Yeah. By relying on a translator, you are literally losing 30% of God's heart.
And he doesn't leave any wiggle room either. He issues a direct ultimatum to his American audience, essentially saying, I've spent an hour and 15 minutes explaining why you need this. I'm giving you 3 years.
3 years to learn Korean.
Right. He declares that starting in 1985, he will completely stop using an interpreter. If you don't understand Korean by then, you are simply cut off from divine revelation. And he even spins the extreme difficulty of learning it as a feature, not a bug. He argues that the most valuable things in the universe should be the hardest to acquire.
That ultimatum is a brilliant mechanism for forcing commitment, though.
Yeah, how so?
Well, demanding a high-cost, high-effort sacrifice, like mastering one of the most difficult languages for an English speaker, acts as a massive filter.
Oh, sure. It weeds out the tourists.
Exactly. It weeds out the uncommitted and deeply bonds the core followers who endure the shared struggle. But, this demand for absolute unity doesn't stop at the vocabulary of individuals.
Or it gets much bigger.
Once the individual is locked in, the system scales this exact same logic dramatically up to the global stage.
Right. Let's look at how this cosmic theology maps onto actual 20th century geopolitics. Because if language unites individuals, how do nations fit into this divine battlefield?
It's a direct mapping.
The architecture draws a direct, unbroken line from the Garden of Eden straight to the Cold War. It operates on this concept called the law of restoration.
Which is fascinating.
Yeah, it claims that the seeds of all global conflict were sown with Adam, Eve, and the Archangel, and that exact pattern must dictate modern warfare.
The law of restoration functions almost like a cosmic fractal or a theatrical play where the script never changes, only the actors.
The roles are set.
Right. The original mistake in Eden has to be repeated and resolved on a global scale. So when interpreting World War II, the philosophy categorizes nations into highly specific heavenly and satanic blocks.
Okay, break that down for us.
On the heavenly side, America was placed in the position of Adam, England was Eve, and France was the Archangel.
Okay.
And on the satanic side, it's the dark mirror image. Germany as Adam, Japan as Eve, and Italy as the Archangel.
So what does this all mean for the people living through it? It's essentially casting global superpowers as characters in a cosmic play, right?
Right.
Assigning roles based on their historical alliances, their cultural traits, and, who birthed whom. Like, England gave birth to the American colonies. So England is the mother, or Eve, and America is the resulting Adam. France aided that birth without being the mother, so they are the Archangel.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it provides a profoundly neat theological explanation for the absolute chaos of the 20th century.
It makes sense of the madness.
It reframes geopolitical maneuvering not as messy political disagreements over resources or borders, but as a literal scripted battle for God's real estate on Earth.
Wow.
But the script takes a really dark turn after World War II.
It does, because the heavenly side, America and its allies, won the war. And according to this roadmap, America was supposed to immediately embrace its defeated enemies, inherit the globe, and Christianize the entire world.
That was the divine plan.
But America failed to do that. And because the Adam nation failed to establish this global kingdom, God lost massive ground on the global stage.
And while spiritual nature abhors a vacuum. Because America failed, the philosophy claims that communism arose specifically to fill that void. But notice the mechanism here. It doesn't just call communism a bad economic or political system.
No, it goes way further.
It defines it as the satanic imitation of the Messiah. The logic is that because the true Messiah operates on a world level, Satan deployed communism as a false world-level salvation movement to arrive one step ahead of the true one.
That reframes the entire Cold War. It even claims the United Nations was turned into a communistic tool because of America's failure.
Yeah, the UN gets heavily criticized here.
So where does the movement itself fit into this disaster? The philosophy casts its followers as being in a 40-year wilderness period, and it stretches exactly from 1945 to 1985.
It's very precise.
It directly invokes the Moses metaphor, right? A time of wandering, of people losing their faith in the desert, of the world losing its moral compass.
And the Moses metaphor is the engine of their geopolitical motivation. They believe they have a divine mandate to march out of this wilderness, plant God's banner in Moscow, and completely defeat communism.
Just march right in.
But crucially, they intend to do this not with nuclear weapons, but through superior theory and the establishment of a godly United Nations. They argue that their ideology, which the speaker terms loveism, is the only conceptual framework capable of digesting and overcoming Marxist theory.
I understand the theory, but wait. If you're demanding global unity, but you've just spent decades casting whole nations as literal enemies and assigning them demonic or heavenly roles, how on earth do you expect people on the ground to actually fight this war and get along?
It sounds impossible.
Right. What are the practical mechanics of winning that?
And that brings us to the tactical deployment of social roles, specifically regarding race and gender.
Okay.
To defeat a global enemy, you need a unified global front. First, the philosophy tackles race. It explicitly states the mission is to prevent an apocalyptic racial conflict, which it predicts communists will try to instigate to destroy America from the inside.
So race is a weapon.
Yes. And to counteract this, it preaches a doctrine of absolute racial unity, using a very direct analogy about animals in nature.
Right. It points out that white, black, and brown dogs or cows grazing in a meadow, they never exhibit racial discrimination.
They don't care at all.
They don't care about the color of the animal next to them.
Oh.
So the argument is that human racial resentment is entirely unnatural. It's an artificial construct.
And to dismantle that construct in America, the strategy demands a radical behavioral shift. It calls on white Americans to voluntarily humble themselves and serve people of other races.
Wow.
The underlying mechanism is that only this kind of radical, voluntary humility can establish the foundation of true love necessary to stop a race war and ultimately cut off the communist strategy of exploiting social divisions.
I find this fascinating, but really paradoxical.
How so?
Well, when we shift from race to gender, the strategy becomes incredibly complex. The philosophy leans heavily on what look like traditional, almost patriarchal structures, right? Following a supreme father figure, rigid family hierarchies.
Yeah.
Yet, it simultaneously tasks women with being the ultimate active heavenly soldiers who must subjugate men to literally save the world. It's a very unusual power dynamic.
This raises an important question about how the movement uses historical and gendered friction to force unity.
Friction is the key word.
Exactly. The theology dictates that since it was the original Eve who first violated the law of love in Eden, it must be the restored women of today who actively overcome the fallen archangel, which, in this context, represents men in Satan's forces.
That is heavy.
But the most intense application of this friction involves nationality.
Yes, the crucible of living together. The strategy dictates that Japanese women were mobilized and sent to America as missionaries.
Right.
Because Japan is the Eve nation and America is the Adam nation, American members were instructed to follow the leadership of these Japanese women, to be nourished and directed by them.
I mean, imagine the psychological pressure. We are talking about the early 1980s. The philosophy openly acknowledges that many Americans, perhaps families of World War II veterans, would naturally resist being close to a Japanese person, let alone taking spiritual orders from one in their own living room.
It's wild to think about.
But the system demands that Americans, Germans, Japanese, and Koreans, historical bloody enemies, must overcome their past and literally unite under one roof as a single family unit.
It deliberately engineers intense interpersonal friction. It forces historical enemies to submit to one another in leadership roles, basically to burn away their old nationalistic egos.
Burn away is exactly right.
The system explicitly warns that unless you can exhibit this unity, unless you can completely unite with your historical enemy in your own home, you will not qualify as a heavenly citizen.
It's a forced structural mechanism.
Right, designed to melt down diverse national identities and recast them into a single, monolithic, global culture.
It is the ultimate test of indemnity.
Yeah.
If you can survive that crucible, your commitment to the ideology is practically unbreakable. It completely rewires your social and political identity until the only thing left is the worldview itself.
As we step back from this deep dive, the sheer scale of what we've mapped out is just staggering.
It really is.
We started with this deeply intimate, almost vulnerable concept, God needing a human object just to experience the reality of love.
Right.
And from that single foundational premise, the architecture builds out a mandatory requirement for a brand new universal language, casts modern nations as biblical characters fighting a scripted Cold War, demands the creation of a godly United Nations, and relies on radical humility and women subjugating archangels to defeat global communism.
It truly is a masterclass in the mechanics of a totalizing ideology.
Absolutely.
Exploring a worldview this comprehensive is incredibly revealing, regardless of your personal beliefs. It shows us exactly how systems of thought operate when they attempt to make sense of a chaotic, frightening world.
They give you a map for everything.
By offering an answer for absolutely everything, from why you speak English to why World War II happened, it provides an overwhelming sense of certainty and purpose to anyone willing to pay the price of admission.
It promises a complete end to the chaos. But, the mechanics of this system suggest that achieving true global peace requires everyone to eventually speak the exact same language, follow the exact same leadership structure, and just melt away their national identities.
Which is a huge demand.
And it begs a really profound question for you to consider as you go about your week. Because we see similar mechanics outside of theology all the time.
Oh, definitely.
Think about modern tech monopolies or intense corporate cultures that demand you adopt their unified corporate language. Like, align perfectly with their overarching mission and erase your personal identity for the sake of the company's unity.
It happens every day.
Are these modern environments using the exact same psychological levers to build their own motherlands? Do sweeping unified visions always require the erasure of the individual?
That is the eternal danger of demanding perfect alignment.
Something to keep in mind the next time you're asked to speak the company language. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.